machine.
Got it.
Great. And Marian, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started here, and hopefully you all can see my screen. So thanks folks for joining. My name is Marian Wolz. I'm the Global Warming Solutions Act Coordinator with the Agency of Natural Resources and have been Jens, do you want to introduce yourself before we start?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jens Hilke with Fish and Wildlife. Pleasure to be with you.
Great. So before we jump in, we have just a couple of housekeeping slides here. So for folks who are familiar with Microsoft Teams or are not, there's a couple of key things you should keep an eye on. And hopefully this looks similar for most of you. It might be on the top or bottom of your screen, depending on which platform you're using. But the button on the left there that looks like a little video icon is how you would turn your video on and off. I'd recommend that if you start seeing low internet connection or something is breaking up for you, just try turning your video off and it may help with your connection. Next to the video icon is a microphone icon, and that's obviously to keep your mic on or off. We'd ask folks to please keep your microphones off through the presentation, as we're going to be also keeping questions limited to the chat. So if you have questions as Jens and I are presenting, please post those in the chat. So keep your mic off unless we're opening up for verbal questions. And then, as I mentioned, the chat function, so it looks like the little written chat icon there. You can click that and keep it open for the entire time to see folks' questions as they come up. And we'll be monitoring questions through there, and we'll have 3 breaks for questions throughout the presentation to walk through those as we go through this section. All right. Anything I've missed there, Jens?
You're good to go.
Great. All right. So our agenda today, we have 4 key sections. The first is going to be an overview of the Vermont Climate Action Plan, and I'll provide that and give you all a sense of what's included in the plan and how it's relevant to your work as conservation folks or municipal officials. Section 2, we'll talk about capacity for planning and climate change work in your communities. Section 3, we'll talk about outreach, and Section 4, we'll talk about planning and regulation. So all relevant to climate change work in your communities, and hopefully there will be information for you all to draw on as you move to your communities to do climate change work. All right, so we're here to talk to you today about climate change and the relevance and the work that was included in the Vermont Climate Action Plan that was adopted December 1st of last year. So climate change is defined as the long-term regional or even global average changes of temperature, humidity, and rainfall patterns over seasons, years, or decades. Climate change, as many of you all know, is having impacts across Vermont. Our summers and winters are getting warmer, precipitation is increasing, and the days of intense rainfall that we're seeing has doubled over the past 50 years. We also know that impacts from climate change are not felt evenly across Vermont, and that is a key thing to think about as you all in your communities consider taking climate action. So before I jump into talking about the Vermont Climate Action Plan, I want to point you all to something called the Vermont Climate Assessment. And Jens has a link to their website that he can post in the chat for you all today. But the Vermont Climate Assessment was conducted by 2021, and it takes a deep dive into climate change and the impacts that climate change will have and is having on Vermont natural and human communities, industries, and sectors. So where the Vermont Climate Assessment really takes the scientific data on climate change and translates that into Vermont impacts, what I'll talk about in just a moment, the Vermont Climate Action Plan, takes those impacts and recommends policies and programmatic changes to help Vermont meet those challenges. So I would recommend that for specific information on impacts to wildlife, forestry, agriculture, and a number of other sectors and industries in Vermont, I'd highly recommend you all go check out the Vermont Climate Assessment. They have a very helpful summary of key messages that they've used that you can find on their website. And I've pulled 3 of them here for you all to look at today, just so you get a sense of the type of information that they've pulled into the climate assessment. So the first key message is around bird species in Vermont. So their first message is, as climate change worsens, 92 bird species, including the iconic loon and hermit thrush, are expected to disappear within the next 25 years. Climate change is expected to continue to exacerbate the threats that invasive plants and insects and disease already pose to the health of Vermont's forests. And this is really compounded by other climate-related factors such as worsening storms, irregular precipitation, and drought. And climate change impacts will be really severe for urban trees because of the effects of the built environment on our temperature and water cycling, as well as additional stressors associated with urban trees. So key messages to keep in mind as you all think about the work that you're doing in your communities, and I highly recommend folks take a look at the Vermont Climate Assessment. So pivoting now to the Climate Action Plan and the first part of our presentation today. So I'll give you a bit of background into the development of the Climate Action Plan, and then we'll walk through some of the key policy and programmatic recommendations that came out of that plan. So in 2020, the Vermont legislature passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, or GWSA, as you see the acronym here at the top of the screen. The act was created in response to concerns around Vermont's climate change and the magnitude of what must be done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for the impacts of climate change on Vermont's landscape. The act requires Vermont to reduce greenhouse gas pollution to 26% below 2005 levels by 2025, 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Those targets that are requirements for the state come from the Paris Accord, which aims to keep global average increases in temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. In addition to the emissions reductions requirements, the law also directs the council to consider opportunities for conservation through long-term carbon sequestration, identifying actions that Vermont communities can take to better prepare for extreme weather and climate impacts, encourage smart growth and related strategies, and limit the use of chemical substances or other products that contribute to climate change. The act established the Vermont Climate Council, which is a 23-member body made up of both legislative appointments and administration officials, and charged the council with writing and finalizing a climate action plan by December 1st, 2021. So you'll see on the slide here, I'm not going to read through all of these, but these are requirements that the Global Warming Solutions Act charged to the Climate Council that is outlined in the law itself. And all of these are components that are included in the Climate Action Plan that was finalized on December 1st. So what's included in the Climate Action Plan? Jens has a link to both the full Climate Action Plan, which is a lengthy document, I will warn you all. It's not exactly light reading, as well as a short summary that we have posted on our website, climatechange.vermont.gov. So the Climate Council worked on writing the Climate Action Plan over the course of 2021. It was a fast and very involved effort with a lot of help from volunteers and state employees, and it really took a lot of time and effort to pull this document together. When the Global Warming Solutions Act set up the Climate Council, the council then set up 5 subcommittees that are charged with different aspects of writing the plan or providing data and analysis to support the policy recommendations that are included in the plan. Those 5 subcommittees are the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, which is really charged with thinking about how do we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, which is charged with thinking about the impacts of climate change on our agriculture and ecosystems. The Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, which is charged with thinking about how do we help rural communities adapt to the impacts that climate change is going to pose on them, their economies, their communities, their built environment. The Science and Data Subcommittee, which is really charged with providing the data and scientific analysis needed to support the Climate Action Plan. And the Just Transition Subcommittee, which is charged with thinking about how do we ensure that a transition to addressing the impacts of climate change doesn't leave behind our most vulnerable and is really a just transition for all of those in Vermont. So we have all of those 5 subcommittees working closely with the Climate Council in developing the Climate Action Plan, and it resulted in a Climate Action Plan that's broken down recommendations across policy and programmatic changes into 5 sections. The first section covers pathways, which are sort of our broad level recommendations, pathways for emissions reductions. The second is adaptation and building resilience in communities in the built environment. The third is adaptation and building resilience in natural and working lands. The fourth is pathways for sequestration and storage of carbon. And the fifth are cross-cutting pathways, so those issues that really cut across all of those buckets of climate action. So the Climate Action Plan was passed December 1st of 2021. It will be revised and updated every 4 years. It includes an implementation section and really key information for decision makers, as well as a framework for measuring progress as we move forward. Now, before I jump too much into the details of what's actually in the Climate Action Plan, we do need to highlight and understand that not all people are equally impacted by climate change. And that understanding was really key to the Council's work as the CAP, or Climate Action Plan, was developed. While there's still a lot of space to improve the centering of impacted and frontline communities in climate discussions, and that's a key component of the Climate Council's work moving forward, the Just Transition Subcommittee of the Climate Council did develop something called the Guiding Principles for a Just Transition, which is really a framework for the Climate Council and its subcommittees to use to evaluate, adjust, and prioritize recommendations based on how they will impact Vermont's frontline communities. There are 6 key principles of those guiding principles, and you'll see them on the screen here. And the subcommittees used something called a scoring rubric to evaluate the recommendations included in the Climate Action Plan against these 6 key components. So as the Council continues to work this year on implementing the Climate Action Plan, discussions are growing about how to continue to use the guiding principles to inform climate work across state government as programs and policies start to be built out and implemented. So for your work in your communities, Jens put the link in the chat to the guiding principles, which also has the scoring rubric at the end of that document. I would highly recommend you all take a look at those and think about how to incorporate those components or the scoring rubric into your work at a municipal level to guide policy and programmatic development around climate change. So wrapping up, thinking about broadly the Climate Action Plan, and then we'll jump into a couple of key recommendations. As I said, it's a big document. There are 26 pathways, which are really the broad, high-level policy recommendations that cover all those buckets of climate change. There are 64 strategies, which are really the statements of measurable activity, and 234 operational tasks that can be taken at the state level or regional level to help impact climate change across all of those buckets. So it's really a broad document. We're still working on how to make it more digestible for the public. So keep an eye on our website as that work continues this year. But really, it's indicative of all of the work that needs to happen for our communities to be able to adjust to climate change impacts. It's really a broad suite of work. So the Climate Action Plan can generally be put into 5 impact areas: cross-cutting. Cutting climate pollution, so really reducing our greenhouse gas emissions statewide, capturing carbon that really focuses on carbon sequestration and storage actions, resilient natural and working lands, so preparing farms and forests and our ecosystems for climate change, vital communities, so really thinking about our communities and the built environment and ensuring we're protecting those people and infrastructure from climate impacts, and then our cross-cutting solutions, so it focuses on workforce development, our compact settlements, and those types of issues that cross a number of these broader impact areas. So there's a lot of information in here. As I said, there's 234 discrete actions in the Climate Action Plan. I pulled out just a handful that cover the resilient working and natural lands and vital communities that I thought may be of interest for you all in this webinar today. So resilient and natural and working lands, this was a primary focus of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, but was also supported by the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee. So there's a number of, again, a broad range of actions included in here, but I pulled out a couple that may be of interest. The first is around recommending providing enhanced technical assistance at the regional level, but also outreach and education for landowners and community members to develop and implement town plans intended to maintain forest blocks as authorized by Act 171. The second recommendation is around examining implications and considering establishing a state policy of no net loss of natural and working lands and the potential aspiration for a net gain of natural and working lands across the state. The third is identifying lands that need conservation because they're adjacent to the built environment that have a large impact on human health, well-being, and equity. The fourth is increasing support and funding and education for urban tree planting efforts to increase access to natural spaces in our urban communities, as well as increase carbon storage and sequestration. And then the fourth is expanding nature-based solutions and understanding of our traditional ecological knowledge, both through investing in strategic conservation, as well as promoting healthy connected river corridors, floodplains, and wetlands. So this is really just a sample of the programmatic and policy recommendations included in this one specific section of the Climate Action Plan, but I would encourage you all to take a look at that, as a lot of these actions are moving forward as we look at implementing the Climate Action Plan. So then I've also pulled out just a handful of recommendations for you all related to vital communities, so protecting people and infrastructure from our climate impacts. And we'll actually expand on these a bit more, as the subcommittee that was working primarily on vital communities was the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee. And they were focused a lot on capacity and how we can help municipalities and folks at the local level increase their capacity to be able to put climate action planning at the forefront of the work that they're doing. So a handful of recommendations that came out of that section. The first was creating and funding a natural resource staff person at regional planning commissions to help implement climate policies and natural resource requirements of Act 171. And the second is prioritize planning practices and investments that help Vermont communities broadly prepare for the impacts of climate change. And there are a number of solutions included in there. The first was around developing a climate toolkit that will connect municipalities with technical assistance, tools, and resources to help them with climate planning, as well as helping update land use policies to better support adaptive, resilient, compact settlement. So again, there's a lot in there. I'm just pulling out a handful to give you all a sample of what's included in the Climate Action Plan as we start thinking about the breadth of work that's included in climate action broadly. So the Climate Action Plan was passed in December 1st, 2021. What happens now? So there are a couple of things that are happening. A large part is that a lot of the action has actually moved back to the legislature. So they are working on, with support and testimony from both the Agency of Natural Resources and climate counselors and subcommittee members, identifying a suite of high impact policies that they can start to look at implementing this year that will impact durable environmental outcomes. And I'll point you all to a link to a document that's saved on our website that Jens just put in the chat that has a list of all of the bills that are currently in the legislature that are tied in some way to recommendations from the Climate Action Plan. That list is broken out into two categories. The first is really those bills that have a lot of support behind them and are moving forward, and a second category, which are those bills that we're a little uncertain of their future, but still have a close tie to the Climate Action Plan. So I think that gives you a good picture of the wide range of recommendations that the legislature has taken, as well as our partner organizations to lobby for in the legislature this year. Next, both the legislature and counselors from the Climate Council are thinking about fully appropriating ARPA, or American Rescue Plan Act, dollars for climate action. So I think many of us know that there's really a lot of money coming into the state right now in terms of ARPA monies allocated to both municipalities and state agencies and the legislature to allocate. We are advocating for identifying opportunities that use that one-time flush of monies to augment federal funds to help move forward climate action as identified in the Climate Action Plan. So there's a number of recommendations that the governor included in his proposed budget to focus ARPA monies on weatherization, increasing access to electric vehicle charging stations, as well as increasing funds for urban tree planting, economic agronomical practices, and a handful of other solutions. So we, with the Climate Council, the Agency of Natural Resources, and the legislature are working hand in hand to try and ensure that those initiatives are moving forward. We at the Climate Council are also working working to understand those components of analysis and contractor support that need to be continued to further flesh out the work of the climate action plan. So we are working to actually expand improvements to the state's greenhouse gas emissions inventory and our carbon budget. We're looking at establishing a contract for data collection and building a management and tracking progress tool, which will help us at the state keep track of both our emissions reductions and sort of the policies that are informing those, as well as sequestration, adaptation, and resilience metrics, which are yet to be developed, and that's something we're working on this year. As I said earlier, we're looking at creating a municipal climate toolkit, as well as a municipal vulnerability index, which will inform a lot of the work that's happening at a municipal level. And we're continuing to expand public outreach and engagement, and are looking at doing a handful of online webinars later this spring to help further engage the public in what's happening with the climate action plan and the work in the legislature this year. And then lastly, we are continuing to advocate at the legislature, who makes appointments to the Climate Council, for diverse appointments to the Climate Council moving forward as terms expire. So we understand that we need to continue our work to reach those frontline and impacted communities, and are trying to advocate for those folks to actually be included in the Climate Council's work. That being said, we actually have a handful of subcommittees that are seeking nominations for new subcommittee members. So subcommittees can include membership both from the Climate Council or folks who are not on the Climate Council. And there are a handful of subcommittees that are looking for new members to broaden sort of their expertise and lived experience for the voices they have around the table. So I believe Jens has a link to the survey. We actually have a survey that's open for another 5 days until March 15th that's seeking nominations to a number of subcommittees. If you or anyone you know is interested in serving on the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, rural resilience and adaptation subcommittee, just transitions, or science and data, we're interested in seeking nominations, and we'll continue to move forward with reaching out to folks who have expressed interest in working on those subcommittees. So I'd encourage you all to take a look at that and share it with your networks, as we're looking for a wide range of appointments. Okay, so that is all I have for you all today on broad overview of the climate action plan, as well as a handful of components of the actions that are included in there. Again, a lot that I didn't cover, but I'd recommend you all take a look both at the summary documents and the entire climate action plan, if that's something you're interested in doing. So I think we have a couple minutes for questions, and then I can move on to the next section.
Folks, we do have a few questions in the chat. Please do feel free to keep those coming. I see that a couple of you are having issues. Teams can be a fickle thing, and so I apologize if you're having any problems. The links I sent should be working, Betsy, so just give that another try. That's likely a computer issue. But anyway, just please do keep those questions coming. Marian, in number 5, in the justice section of the CAP, considering impact of climate change let me start over. Section of the CAP, considering impact of climate change itself, as well as impact of the proposed changes?
Yes, so I think, are you asking about the work of the Just Transition Subcommittee? Is that, you think, what they're referring to?
Yeah, it was that. It was related to that slide.
Yes, that's a great question. So yes, we are considering both the direct impacts that climate change and the impacts that climate change has on our weather and extreme events that we're seeing, what that has on our communities, but also the impact of the policies. And so the subcommittees actually went through an exercise of taking those guiding principles and the scoring rubric that I said was attached with those, and using those questions to guide their assessment of their proposed policies against those equity considerations. So take, for example, the clean heat standard, which is one of the major components of the climate action plan that's moving through the legislature right now. The cross-sector mitigation subcommittee took those elements of that equity assessment essentially and used it to think about the clean heat standard and how that may impact impacted communities. So it's both looking at the impacts of climate change and the impact of the proposed policies and programs on impacted communities. So great question, and it's both is the answer.
Thanks, Marian. How can we create net gains in natural lands, asks Jeff.
Great question, Jeff, and I unfortunately don't have the best answer for you. This was a lot of conversation at the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, thinking about how we work on our forestry practices to increase carbon sequestration, increase protections on wetlands and natural lands. If you notice the wording of that particular action, it was to investigate creating a policy of no net loss and then a potential of net gain. So they're really recommending a group come together to actually study what that would look like and how that would work for a state level policy. So I don't have a great answer for you. Their recommendation was really to think about what that would look like and how that would be implemented at a state level.
The vulnerability index could be useful for ARPA planning. When will that be available?
I know it would be fantastic for ARPA planning. Unfortunately, it may be a little late for that. We're just getting a task group off the ground that's developing the RFP that will then be shared, and we'll be looking for bids from contractors to help build that tool. So looking at likely a year or two before that's finalized and ready for public use. That being said, ARPA, it's, I think, 2 years until funds have to be allocated and then 4 years until they have to be spent down. So it may work out for the timeline there, but we're just getting off the ground with that work. So it may be a little while before you see that go public.
Thanks. Is EAN's energy dashboard being utilized for any of the measurements?
Great question. And EAN was an integral part of the work of the Climate Council and the development of the Climate Action Plan. So EAN's director, Jared Duvall, actually sits as a member of the Climate Council and a co-chair of the Science and Data Subcommittee. So a lot of the information and data and analysis that EAN brings to the table and helps compile for their dashboard was brought into the conversations for the Climate Action Plan and the development of policies there. He also, a lot of the work that the and I'm not going to remember the name here, but those EAN will do grants to small groups to think about developing policies further. I think they call them action teams. A lot of the recommendations from action teams were actually used to inform policies that are being recommended in the Climate Action Plan. So there's a lot of connection and work between EAN, Energy Action Network. Sorry, I see the component here about acronyms. I'll try and spell those out. So EAN is Energy Action Network. They're a nonprofit action group of folks really focused on greenhouse gas reductions, and they had a lot of involvement in work. And I believe Jared is actually involved in the Measuring and Assessing Progress work group that's looking at building out that tool, so is going to be bringing a lot of that work from Energy Action Network to the table there.
And the last question, I think, is probably a good lead into the rest of the webinar. And what should Vermont towns be doing now?
Great question. So I will say that I think if you were to go look through the Climate Action Plan, a lot of the recommendations are really focused on state level policy, state level programs that can help bring capacity to Vermont municipalities. There is a section of the Climate Action Plan that broadly focuses on actions that individuals can take, mostly around greenhouse gas reductions, with a lesser emphasis on resilience and adaptation and carbon sequestration. But I'm going to walk through a focus on conservation and really building conservation capacity and thinking about climate planning at your municipal level that can help you kick the ball or get the ball rolling on climate action in your community. So great segue, and we'll get into that right now. So thinking about community capacity as we sort of switch from the state level policy discussion around what's included in the Climate Action Plan and the policies that are being considered at the legislature, to thinking about many of you who are involved in community conversations around conservation and what you all can do in the face of climate change. So different communities have different strengths, and I think we'll pull up this pyramid here to start thinking about those. But it's important as you consider work around climate, around any of those buckets that I identified, to think about the type of capital that exists in your communities, whether that be natural capital, human and social capital, or built capital in your communities. So this community capital pyramid is really a reminder that the human and social capital and the work that you all do to create that is really the glue between the natural capital you all have and the built environment capital of your communities. So keeping in mind those levels of capital will be important as you consider building conservation capacity in your communities, thinking about building resilience and adaptation in your communities in the face of climate change, and what really you have as strengths to help inform the work that you're going to do moving forward. So again, thinking about local conservation capacity, I think it's important to start thinking about building it a structure that will be maintained long term for you all, understanding that a lot of conservation work happens through volunteers and in volunteer capacity. It's important at the bottom to start thinking about, if you don't already have one, building a conservation commission or ensuring that you have a team of folks at a municipal level who can help advocate for conservation changes in your community. It's then important, I think, and this is something I'll talk about in just a bit, to conduct a natural resources inventory. So to think about that really natural ecological capital that you have in your community, build out those profiles and understand what may be at risk in your community so you can assess that for climate change planning. And then the third is thinking about funding. So potentially you might want to think about starting a conservation commission and working with partners to think about paying for conservation in your communities. You know, as we thought a lot about this in the development of the climate action plan, there's a number of factors from, you know, climate change impacts on our wildlife and natural communities, and also the human impacts on our built environment, on forest fragmentation and development pressures that I think we saw grow because of COVID, that it's important to start thinking holistically about where are ecological and community priorities and how do we actually fund the conservation of those moving forward. So as I referenced a little bit earlier when talking about the climate action plan, resilience, or really the capacity of a community to prevent, withstand, respond to, and recover from a disruption, is one of the key aspects of climate change planning that you all in your communities really need to think about. So not only do we need to lower our greenhouse gas emissions, think about sequestration of carbon, but also think about how do we as communities prepare for and recover from climate change impacts, both at the human scale and at our natural communities scale. So when I think of climate resilience, there are 4 key aspects that should be considered. The first is community connectedness. So thinking about that human capital that your community has through both official and unofficial social network structures, and how to better build that at a community level. And these are actions that even conservation commissions can take, whether it be, you know, walk through your community, thinking about both community building and identification of natural communities, holding webinars or series where you can meet and greet folks and learn about specific resources in your community. I think to provide an example from COVID, you know, we often saw that communities that did a really great job with community building prior to COVID were often better prepared to handle COVID through consistently and appropriately rendering aid throughout their communities through both official and unofficial networks. So that same focus on community building should be carried forward as you start to think about climate resilience in your community. The next is thinking about available resources. So whether those be financial, ecological, built environment, understanding those resources your community has can really help increase your resilience to disasters. The next is risk and vulnerability. So understanding where your community is most vulnerable, what are those frontline communities, where do you think you have less resources to put towards emergency situations, having a clear understanding of your risks and vulnerabilities at a municipal level, either when it comes to a conservation and sort of wildlife and ecological focus, or whether we're thinking about the human scale, frontline populations, and potentially neighborhoods in your communities that may be more vulnerable. It's really important to understand and inventory those risks so we can be better prepared to respond to them when a climate disaster hits. And then the last component is planning. So has your community taken the time to really think through resilience, either in thinking about emergency sheltering and emergency management structures, conservation planning for ecosystems, long-term planning for community growth and change? All of those are important components of planning, and all of these components together feed into how resilient your community is. So I do want to stress that what resilience looks like for each community can be different, but in assessing and building all of these components, we can really build communities that come out even stronger in the face of climate change. So as we think about planning, there's sort of 2 examples I want to provide to you all, one at the state level and one that's a much broader national level example. Many of you all may be familiar with Flood Ready Vermont. Flooding is the #1 natural hazard that impacts Vermont communities and is the one that most Vermont communities face as their #1 risk. So Flood Ready Vermont has a number of key tips to think about as you think about planning for resilience and adaptation in your communities. And it often falls in line with that table or the graphic I just showed you previously. So assessing your risk for both buildings and infrastructure, and I would include your natural communities in there as well. Ensuring your plans are up to date, municipal plans, flood hazard mitigation plans, the conservation section of municipal plans, ensuring that you have protections in place for those areas that are most at risk. So your river corridors, and ensuring that you're maximizing your flood protections, as well as preparing your buildings that may be most at risk. Updating your municipal road standards is an important component of this, as well as participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. And then the last piece is ensuring you're finding funding to prepare your community. And that's a key component of all of this is, again, a lot of this is happening at a volunteer level. How do we find technical assistance and funding capacity to help build these components in your communities? And then the second example is the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit that I'd recommend folks take a look at. They provide a broad range of available tools and resources and provide a really basic framework for thinking about climate adaptation and resilience planning, exploring hazards, assess your vulnerability, investigate your options, prioritize and plan what those options are, and then take action. So both of these are good examples to think about as you think about climate adaptation, resilience, and planning, whether that be at a conservation scale, a municipal scale, a human scale, for any of the communities in your municipality. So I do want to just point folks quickly to thinking about ARPA funding. I am not an expert in ARPA, so I won't dive into this too much, but we really are at a unique junction right now where there's a lot of money in the state. A lot of the funding that's available to municipalities with ARPA does not have many strings attached in what it can be used for. So I'd highly recommend you all as advocates in your community for specific issues, perhaps it's conservation or otherwise, advocate with your select boards, city council members to think about utilizing those one-time ARPA funds for long-term recovery investment options. The Vermont League of Cities and Towns has a fantastic guide and a number of resources when it comes to municipal ARPA funding, and I'd recommend folks take a look at that. So the last slide for me today is I just want to highlight some ongoing work that's happening at the Climate Council level that you all could potentially be involved with that would help us and I think would in turn help your municipalities. So I mentioned earlier that the Climate Council is looking at developing a climate toolkit with the aim to really connect municipalities with technical assistance, resources, existing tools at a state or regional level across all of those buckets of climate action so that we can really provide a one-stop shop for climate action in our communities. This work is just getting off the ground, and the work group that's working on this has identified they'd like to pull together a focus group of end users of this potential tool to think about gathering their input and what those folks may want to see in this toolkit. So those end users are folks like you, folks involved in your conservation commissions, your planning commissions, select boards, perhaps your paid town official staff, you're an RPC member, or you're a member of your RPC conservation commission, or excuse me, your commission. If you're interested in participating in this focus group, it has already been scheduled for March 23rd from 5 to 6 p.m. We have a basic form to essentially register your interest. Jens has put the link in the chat. So if you're interested or know someone who might be interested in participating in this focus group, we'd love to hear from you. If you're not available on that date, we will also have a survey available with the same questions that we can send, and you could provide written feedback and information to us that will in turn help us develop this toolkit that will be a resource for municipalities. So I just wanted to point folks to that and hope we could get some of you all involved in this focus group. And with that, I'm going to close up my section. I think we have some time for questions, and then I'll hand it back to you, Jens.
Thanks, Marian. Just one question. Could towns use ARPA dollars to create a conservation fund?
Unfortunately, I am not an expert in ARPA. I've only really talked and have a bit more information about ARPA dollars that are available to the state, and there have been some restrictions on being able to use the ARPA funds for conservation work, but that may be a little more loose for the municipal fund. So I would recommend you go to the Vermont League of Cities and Towns website. They have a number of resources on what's available for ARPA and look at it there, because I think what's available for the state to use ARPA funds for is a little bit different than for municipalities. And I did see something in the chat about the date for the focus group. That may have been my fault. It's Wednesday, the 23rd of March, not the 25th. So I'll make that change. I'm sorry for that.
Great. And I'll just share my screen if you would take yours off. All right. So thanks, Marian. Again, my name is Jens Hilke. I'm a conservation biologist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I just wanted to briefly mention, that where I'm coming from. As part of the department, we believe in the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. It's a big mission. It takes us in a variety of different directions. My part of that is I direct the community wildlife program. And so I assist all 251 municipalities in Vermont with their conservation planning, a huge overlap in terms of your climate work. So it's partially webinars and presentations like this, but it's also direct technical assistance for your planning efforts or your conservation efforts. I do night meetings with town boards all the time. My services are free to you, so I'm really happy to work with your town and follow up after this webinar. So, climate change is the most pressing issue of our time, but regrettably, the issue has become pretty politically charged in some communities. And so I think carefully crafting your message can be a helpful way of avoiding some of the pitfalls. Now, current polling in Vermont suggests that leading with concepts related to the outdoors and outdoor recreation can be a good starting point, because those messages are a great way of finding a big tent that can bring everyone on board. It's important that in our climate messaging that we really connect the dots between some of the threats and hazards and challenges that are coming our way with the effects to different parts of our life and landscape. For example, connecting changes in temperature and temperature extremes with impacts on the ski industry or the maple syrup industry. That can help connect the dots for people and make the issue of climate change more real. But for many people, the issue is so real that it leads to a kind of paralysis where they feel that it's so big and so daunting that it's impossible to move forward. So with that in mind, sometimes it can be a good strategy in our messaging to take the climate issue in pieces. So for example, you might do one session, an event or a talk or whatever that focuses on forests and how forests change in the future, as well as how forests mitigate carbon and promote resiliency. Then you could do a separate event to discuss water quality and flooding. So you could take it in bits. Another thing here is that depending on the town and the local culture, it can be appropriate not to lead with a climate message at all if the atmosphere is particularly hostile. And in that kind of case, you might simply lead with the parts and mention climate sort of secondarily. So you could do that messaging around the importance of forests for our ecology, economy, and our communities, and then mention that they're changing due to forest fragmentation and climate. I'm not saying leave out the climate. I'm just saying which messages you lead with can be really important. Literally for 50 years now, the science community has been showing you some version of this graph. And we believe that if we show the projections of the exponential impacts that are coming our way, that rational people would understand the problem and change their ways. That hasn't worked. People don't just make rational decisions. If we did, many fewer people, in my opinion, would be having children or going to college. If we actually weighed the potential costs and benefits of everything we do in a rational way, many of our activities wouldn't take priority. But I wasn't thinking of the cost of my two sons' college education when my wife and I decided to have children. We saw a different sort of calculus and the fundamental joy that being a family would bring us. So we need to exploit that we're not doing rational decision making here. So I think we need to change our climate message, and we need to move away from centering on doom and gloom and focus on joy and celebration and what we really value in our communities. That is the why, right? Not the how, not the what. That's the why. And that why that's what's going to sustain us through the challenges that we need to confront. So as we think about messaging and the events that we plan as we try to make change in our communities, let's start from a place of celebration. Let's start from the consensus of our community values, of what we love about living here as the why. And that should catapult us through the change that we need to make to adapt to our climate future. Now, most Vermonters do believe that change is coming. Here are results from a recent VPR Vermont PBS poll that found that 58% of Vermonters think climate change will have a major impact on life here in the next 30 years. And in fact, only 16% said they don't expect to see much of an impact at all. So we know change is coming. We just need the community will to address it. And that comes from a message that galvanizes people to action. As you think about messaging for climate, it's important that you develop an outreach plan. And a huge part of that is figuring out different audiences. Out. Please remember, and I'm going to say this again, remember that it's important to have fun and craft, and those involved in planning the event actually want to attend and want to be a part of it. That air of celebration is really important here. And in my experience, leading with celebrating place, your town, your community, is the most important aspect of outreach planning. So let me just give you an example. We live in an incredible place. This is an amazing town. We've got forests and waters, recreational opportunities, and rural character. Now that we can celebrate that, and we can celebrate our common values, and that's the place that we can use to then engage in tackling our problems moving forward. Now, as municipal commissions, we need to operationalize this, not only with an outreach plan, but with strategic planning on what our boards are going to do and when. So now I'm just going to, I'm really going from that message to steps our volunteer boards and commissions can take. And that really means engaging in strategic planning. I work with conservation commissions and boards from all over the state on strategic planning to help groups get on the same page in prioritizing what they should do and when. So here's an example of a 4-step process for strategic planning that conservation commissions, energy committees, other groups can use as a way of thinking about how they're going to map out their work related to climate. Strategic planning can be done in one portion of one of your meetings or over several meetings, depending on what you're after. But I do think it's really important to engage in that kind of step back to engage in that planning. Okay, so here's a four-step process. First, your group would want to brainstorm, like, what have you already done as a commission? And where are folks coming from? And what are new ideas beyond what your current commitments are? What are new ideas for Conservation Commission action? Then you could organize that list. Next, you would want to do a capacity assessment. I mean, I'm mostly talking about volunteer groups here. So, how much time does your CC or Energy Committee actually have? How many hours in a month? Next, you want to do the prioritization of that brainstorm list. And you want to define a set of questions, right? You want to ask a set of questions. So you have this list of ideas, and then you ask a set of questions. Does this help implement the town plan? Does this help actually the resource? Are you as an individual interested in taking a lead role in that? Then you would tabulate the scores, and then you would vote. You would vote and then tabulate the scores. And then from that prioritized list, you could develop a work plan, and you would attach, you could reassess that brainstorm list when you've all seen the scores together. You can refine the activities, meaning like add a little bit more information about costs or potential partners. And then you would define the timeline and spread out over 3 to 5 years. So you could really get a sense of what you're going to do when. So I think strategic planning is a part of an important part of this. Okay. I'm running a little bit low on time, but Marian, any questions so far?
Just one quick question that asks, most funding sources care a lot about the what and the how and don't leave a lot of room for celebration. Does the state plan on supporting these kind of softer, friendlier engagement opportunities?
Not as such. Celebration doesn't sound good to funders, but I think it's really a question of how you write it up and how you explain that. And so, there are diverse funding sources, and I think how you write up your outreach plan, you can know in your heart that that's all about celebration, and you can present it to the funders as we're sharing information and assessing community readiness and that sort of thing.
Great. And then one question just came in. Should towns strive for both a conservation commission and an energy committee? One or both?
That's an it depends kind of question. And it goes back to Marian's slide about capacity. I work with towns that are flooded with volunteers. And many of you on this webinar are probably thinking, not in my town. I also work with towns where it's the same 5 people that show up for everything and are on the planning commission and the select board and the conservation commission. So that very much depends on what the capacity is of your community.
And I think too, sort of what energizes your community. If your community is really feeling energized about solar panels and EVs, maybe it makes sense to pull folks together for an energy committee that can also start to think a little bit about conservation, that connection between energy resources, greenhouse gas reductions, and conservation. Whereas if you have a community that's really focused on protecting a specific parcel of land, maybe there's more energy to focus on conservation. And then a quick question from Dakota: how many towns in Vermont have conservation commissions?
It's a little bit more than half of the 251. I think, I don't remember the exact number, but it's a little bit more than half of all towns have a CC or something very close to that.
Okay.
All right.
That's it for questions.
Yep. So in this section, I want to talk a little bit about planning and regulatory actions that we can take at the municipal level. And first, I think you need to understand who at the municipal level is involved. And for most towns, really the public works department or the road crew are actually the department that's most on the front lines of climate change as they deal with the infrastructure that's directly affected. So it's critically important that we bring these groups into the discussion and that we hear directly from them on what they're seeing and what they're going to need in the future. I live in Burlington. Our public works department is very much at the forefront of the discussion. And you can see here their mission is to steward Burlington's infrastructure and environment by delivering efficient, effective, and equitable public service. And they've been really great about increasing bike lanes in the city and helping to make it more pedestrian friendly. But with increasing freeze-thaw cycles, our roads have really been awful recently with potholes, massive potholes, and our sidewalks are getting increasingly icy. Now, a few years ago, we went through our entire winter salt supply by the end of December because we got so much more ice instead of snow. So it's important that residents hear these firsthand experiences and that we involve these departments as partners in addressing climate. There are all sorts of examples of resources for local road crews and departments related to climate. So one example has been an incredibly effective training called the Rivers and Roads training that came out after Hurricane Irene and has really just been instrumental in change in our road design. That's available to all road crews. Another one is the Highways and Habitats training that I offer. So we really need to bring those groups into the discussion. Another important part of municipal government that needs to be involved in climate action planning is the Planning Commission and all the various groups that plug into planning. Now, land use, or what we put where, is among the most important climate-related decisions that municipalities are involved in. So let's just talk for a second about planning in general. Land use planning happens at the town level, and it's optional. And if your community does decide to plan, and I think 96% of Vermont towns do have a town plan, then it's guided by some of the state's overarching goals. Now, the town plan is a visionary document, and it's something of the balancing act between private property rights and the rights of the commons. You're required to touch on certain subjects in your plan, like transportation and energy. And in addition, it's a document with policies. It summarizes a vision, and it includes those policies for what your community wants for its future. Now, the planning process is iterative, and we've been doing this for many, many years. And so in many ways, this is nothing new, but we're just involving more aspects related to climate in our planning process now. We'll say that when we don't do planning well, we can see it, and it costs us all money. The example on screen from Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, devastating damage. But we had an 1896 flood, we had a 1927 flood. We've been getting these consistently, and still we're building structures in floodplains. And so we need to keep these lessons fresh in our mind. Now, I just want to make sure I'm connecting the dots here, that sprawl development is a huge danger in the face of climate change. And if we allow development to happen on its own without sideboards, then we get sprawl and we get development deep in our forest blocks. And that's going to threaten the benefits that we get from those forests, both in terms of carbon storage and resilience. So we need to maintain our recreational and working lands economy to sustain our forests. Now, the department engages in a review of town plans and regulations every 10 years, and Vermont Natural Resources Council has been an important part of that. And in 2010, only 2% of Vermont towns mentioned climate change. And today we're at about somewhere around 20% are recognizing climate change for different reasons. And so I'll just, I see we're out of time, but I just wanted to show you that there's incredible support for non-regulatory tools related to a whole variety of climate-related endeavors, conservation easements and land acquisition and tax abatement programs. So there's real support for those non-regulatory strategies. 96% of all town plans are recommending the utilization of those. And there's actually surprising support for regulatory policies as well. And so we're really making gains in clustering and development, siting standards, and subdivision regulations. So it's important to note that 74% of municipalities recommended subdivision regulations, but only 55% of municipalities have actually implemented them. Okay, so this is highlighting that disconnect between what we acknowledge, what we recommend, and what we're actually willing to implement. Lastly, I just want to bring up that, if you look at the efficacy of different zoning districts, most towns have these residential or ag residential zoning districts, and yet they do very little to address fragmentation. In fact, that's mostly where our sprawl is happening, is in these ag rural residential districts. Many fewer towns have conservation or forest districts, and yet they're doing a much better job of controlling fragmentation and wildlife specific. Okay, we do have a series of upcoming webinars. I encourage you to look at our webpage for trainings like this. And with that, I will stop and say thank you all so very much for joining us. It's really been a pleasure to be with you. I can stay a little bit longer to answer questions, but with that, I will bring this to an end. So thank you all so much. All right, any questions for folks that are still on?
I have two questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. One question is, do you have any examples of celebration where that has been used in the community? And the second question, I'm on the Woodstock Planning Commission, and in our town, we have a 2,000+ acre forest plot, which is a state forest. And what kind of input can the community have, which also might leak into a celebratory attitude about this very rich forest?
Yeah, I have all sorts of examples of celebration. We, as part of the Science to Action Project in Bolton, Jericho, Richmond, and Huntington, we did a whole outreach plan. We had a walks and talks series. We led walks for kids. We led a float down the Winooski River. We led cultural history tour. We led a tour with a forester. All of it was out in the woods. All of it was with that celebration of place. And at the same time, they were doing a natural resource inventory and then eventually led into technical assistance with the Planning Commission. So there's a lot there. In terms of the state lands, you know, there's a whole planning process for state lands, and I think there's a lot we can do to celebrate those places. But you know, plugging into the state land use planning process can be a way of doing that, and working with the local foresters.
How do you do that, though? I mean, there's a state forester, but he's so busy and doing so many different things. And then we have this wonderful, and they're going to log it pretty soon. You know, they do it every 5 or 10 years, and it's due to be logged. And probably, you know, that doesn't seem unreasonable. But on the other hand, can the community get some sense of that? I'm searching for ideas.
Yeah, well, I mean, also from a climate perspective, that land is already conserved. And so, you know, in Woodstock, you have something like 50 or 60% out of state ownership. And so you might want to concentrate on on celebration on some of the private lands in Woodstock. Jim, in terms of resources for municipal planning grant, I would look to the Vermont Planning Manual, and I can give you links to that, and we can talk offline. But there are a lot of great resources there that we can talk about. Okay, with that, I think I'm already late for my next meeting. Thank you all for sticking with us. Again, I'm happy to help you offline, as it were, to follow up on actions that your community can take. So have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
And Marian, thank you so much. That was really excellent.
Thanks, everyone.